Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Andi Siti Shafira Salsabila from Class B English Literature 2019. In this video, I'm going to review about the history of English literature from the Old English era to the 18th century era. Old English period. The first English language was born around 1572 years ago or around 449 AD. This period is known as the Old English era. Old English was influenced by Germans when they invaded Great Britain. The first land of the Angles and Saxons in Britain in the middle of the 5th century. They conquered the Britain to make it their home. Unlike the Romans, they became the ancestors of the English race, and the Old Anglo-Saxon language which formed the basis of modern language. Before the Angles and Saxons came to Britain, they lived along the coast of Sweden and Denmark. They conquered the land and gave it a name, and it was called England. They stood from the 5th century to the 11th century. Then in 1066, Norman conquered the Britain and led by William of Normandy. Most of the Anglo-Saxon poetry is lost and there are some anonymous fragments left. Beowulf is the poem of this period that tells the greatness of a hero. Characteristic of Old English era. Most literature in this period was done by oral tradition. Therefore, they made the song about the wars, gods, religion, and this had been the beginning of a poem in Old English period. Christianity came and gave an impact to the literature, especially poetry. The poets was using religious themes from the subject of the poetry. Most of Anglo-Saxon poetry is religious. Authors and works. In this era, many literary works were written anonymously or no one knows who the author is. However, there were two writers who were dominant in this Anglo-Saxon era, Cædmon and Alfred the Great. Cædmon was an Anglo-Saxon poet known as the father of Old English. He was also known the first Old English Christian poet, whose fragmentary hymn to the creation remains a symbol of the adaptation of the aristocratic, heroic Anglo-Saxon verse tradition to the expression of Christian themes. Alfred the Great. The second writer, Alfred the Great, was a king of the Anglo-Saxon who supported the Anglo-Saxon chronicle describing the life, history, and language of this era. He was a king of the West Saxons at the end of the 9th century, was known as the translator of Cura Pastoralis, a guide to living and spiritual education. Alfred launched a significant translation program of several literary works from Latin to English as a language of learning. He commissioned several more translations of history, geography, and even of Cædmon's hymn into West Saxons, which became the dominant language in the 10th and 11th centuries. Major works of this era. Cædmon's hymn. It dates from the late 7th century, around 670. His hymn is therefore the first song of praise in English culture and the first Christian religious poem in English, although many Latin hymns were known at the time. The theme in the hymn, or song of praise, was that God created the heavens and the earth for the enjoyment of man. The next is Beowulf. Beowulf was written in the 8th century by an unknown writer. Beowulf tells about a legendary hero who kills powerful, frightening creatures and became a king. The poem recalls a shared heroic past somewhere in the general consequence of the audience who would hear it. The language of Beowulf is extremely rich and inventive. Medieval era. The Middle Ages. The medieval period of European history between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance are sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. Medieval era is the period of European history between the 5th and the 15th century from 1066 AD, which Old English period came to an end and the Middle English period began, to 1485 AD. In this period of early Middle Age, there is a big change in language and culture which began to shape Middle English language and Middle English literature. Medieval era, or the Middle Ages, were a period of massive social change, bargaining, nationalism, international conflict, tribal nature, natural disaster, climate change, rebellion, resistance, and renaissance. Geoffrey Chaucer was a medieval English poet, writer, and philosopher best known for his work The Canterbury Tales, a masterpiece of world literature. The Canterbury Tales is a work of poetry featuring a group of pilgrims from different social classes on a journey to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury who agree to tell each other stories to pass the time. His major works are The Book of the Duchess, The House of Fame, Annelida and Arcite, The Parliament of Fowls, The Legend of Good Woman, The Canterbury Tales. Margery Kempe was a medieval mystic and author of the first autobiography in English, the Book of Margery Kempe, which relates her spiritual journey from wife and mother in Bishop's Lane, England, to a caste Christian visionary and popular, if controversial, public speaker. Kempe was literate and dictated her life story first to her son and then to a priest. As she records in her book, and it remains a significant research on Christian spirituality and life in the Middle Ages. Renaissance era. Renaissance means rebirth. From about 15,000 to 16,000, world was reborn in many ways. The Renaissance began in Italy, especially in art and architecture, in the 15th century. As England became the most powerful nation in Europe in the late 16th century, new worlds were discovered and new ways of seeing and thinking developed. In England, there was an important change in religion and politics when King Henry made himself the head of the Church of England, bringing church and state together. We can distinguish three periods of literature of English Renaissance. The first period covers the end of the 15th and the first half of the 16th centuries. In England, the first scholars and humanists appeared. They studied and investigated the antique philosophy literature. The second period, called Elizabethan. It is the time of flourishing the English Renaissance literature, the time of creating of the new literature forms. Shakespeare's masterpieces are created in this period. The third period, the time after Shakespeare's death, and up to 1640, the 40s of the 7th century. It was the time of declining the English Renaissance literature. Characteristic of Elizabethan and Jacob ages. Both the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods in the history of English literature are also known as the Age of Shakespeare. This span of time is the golden age of literature. It was an age of great social contentment. The rapid rise of industrial towns gave employment to thousands. Increasing trade and commerce enriched England. The wealthy were taxed to support the poor. This created the atmosphere for literary activities. It was an era of religious tolerance of peace. It was an age of patriotism. Major author of this era: William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was the greatest writer of the era, born in 1564. He was an actor and poet, but is best known for his plays. He also wrote tragedies and comedies, and Shakespeare became one of the most well-known playwrights in England. Some plays he is well known for are Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, Midsummer Night's Dream, Twelfth Night, and Henry V. Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli was a diplomat in Florence who tried to answer how could a ruler guarantee that he would stay in power by writing The Prince in 1513. Machiavelli claimed that people were greedy and self-centered. He argued that rulers should not be good, and that rulers should do whatever is necessary to keep power and protect their city, including killing and lying. Today, when someone is called a Machiavellian, it means that they are acting tricky and not thinking about the good. Francesco Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was a poet and scholar. He was known for his Italian poetry and wrote many famous poems, such as the Canzoniere and the Triovi. He was also a very enthusiastic Latin scholar and wrote most of his poems in this language. He died in 1374, but he would influence later writers such as Boccaccio and Shakespeare. Major works of this era: Romeo and Juliet. This tragedy about two young lovers is one of Shakespeare's most popular works, and together with Hamlet, one of the most frequently staged. Today, the characters Romeo and Juliet are considered archetypes of young lovers. Hamlet, written between 1599 and 1602. This tragedy of Shakespeare is about Prince Hamlet and his revenge against his uncle Claudius, accused of murdering Hamlet's father. Hamlet is the most extensive work of the English author and one of the influential. It was also popular during the life of Shakespeare and is one of the most represented in the history of theater. In addition, it is one of the most cited works, and critics often include it among the greatest literary works in history. Utopia. At the same time, fiction and political work, this book was published in Latin in the year 1516 and tells a story centered on a fictional society that lives on an island. The word utopia comes from the Greek and means no place or nowhere. The work was popular in its time, although also misunderstood. At present, the title of the book eclipses the central story created by Moro and is used when speaking of utopian society. In that sense, utopia is truly important in literary history for creating the notion of parallel realities and closed societies in themselves. Revolution and Restoration era. King Charles I was executed in January 1649. He was the supreme king of Britain, with sovereignty over England, Scotland, and Ireland. However, he earned a lot of respect from Parliament for his plausible theory, or commonly known as the Divine King's Rights. In his later years, he was involved in the Civil War. First, the English Civil War, 1642, was against Parliament and the Puritans in England. He lost the War of 1645, but he kept his ideology. In 1948, there was the Second Civil War, and he was defeated again in 1649. This time he was arrested, tried, found guilty, and finally sentenced to death for treason. Characteristic of Revolution and Restoration era. The most prominent form of poetry during the Restoration period is the heroic couplet, a form of poetry in which each line contains 5 strong stress in each second syllable, and every 2 lines rhyme with each other. The most popular form of drama during the Restoration period was comedy of manners. This period was marked by the use of reason, not imagination. Major authors and works of this period. John Dryden. John Dryden was known as a playwright, critic, and satirist. His poems reflect the political upheavals and religious conflict that have existed since Puritan times and also reflect Dryden's fickle stance. In religion, he is also inconsistent, always changing religion. Dryden's superiority is in satire, political, religious story poems, and some thread drama, which are often called heroic tragedies because they are written in the form of a heroic couplet. His works include The Conquest of Granada, The Indian Queen, and Aurangzeb. William Congreve. William Congreve was the greatest skit writer of the Restoration period. He was heavily influenced by Molière, the French writer, and like the leading authors, satirized the attitude of the people at the time. His works are Love for Love and The Way of the World. Thomas Hobbes was a naturalist who stated that natural science should be the foundation of all human knowledge. His ideas are expressed in the book The Leviathan. The 18th century era. The 18th century in English literature has been called the Augustan Age, the Neoclassical Age, and the Age of Reason. It was termed the Augustan Age because literature writers during the time were consequently imitating the works of the original Augustan writers, Horace and Virgil, who had lived during the time of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and generally regarded as a golden age, like the period of Roman history which had achieved political stability and power as well as a flourishing of the artists. Characteristic of 18th century era. This period, in the first place, is called the Classical Age because reason dominated emotion. The writers of this age were governed by set rules and principles. The period is also called the Age of Reason and Good Sense. An important characteristic of the age was the belief that literature must follow nature. The literature of the age was concerned with the follies and foibles of the times. The language of poetry became gaudy and inane. The ordinary language was kept out from poetic literature. Major authors and works. Daniel Defoe. Daniel Defoe came to sustain prose fiction late in a career of quite various, often disputatious writing. The variety of interest that he had pursued in all his occasional work left its mark on his more lasting achievements. His distinction, though earned in other fields of writing than the polemical, is constantly underpinned by the generous range of his curiosity. His major works are Robinson Crusoe. He got huge, successful start from the works. The novel, an immediate success at home and on the continent, is a unique fictional blending of the traditions of Puritan spiritual autobiography with an insistent scrutiny of the nature of man, a social creature, and an extraordinary ability to invent a sustaining modern myth. Samuel Richardson. He was a self-educated London tradesman with little practical knowledge of what would have been called at the time polite society or of elegant literature. His major works are Pamela. The novel was written by Samuel Richardson. the first published in 1740 with 6 London editions in 1744. The novel being appreciated unstoppable by Rousseau in the speech. It translated in many versions, French the first, then Dutch and German language. The promotion began in Edinburgh in 1726. That's all from me. Thank you so much for watching. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.